So glad to be here and to kind of round out this first group of 4 lectures. I hope we've had 3 lectures that were directly at buildings, and I'm going to come around to those a little bit, but try to make a couple points. And Patrick had asked me to show some of the watercolors and things that I've been doing. And I demurred to begin with, and then I came back around to it. So the second half, well, in different pieces, that'll be a little bit what we're looking at. And I'll try to make some connections to why we do things like that and how we should think about it and along with things. And it's probably a different side, you know, undergraduates, if you're in the upper years, you've had me in building materials and assemblies, and the younger students are going to. And it's a little bit of a different side of, and I'm trying to tie those two together about what we're doing when we're thinking about the composition of a building and sort of what the broad range of that is. Underneath then what an architect may be doing to sort of broaden out the world that they're operating in, or to be able to think about things. So that's where we're going. So a prelude, and several people have told me this is an obsession. So since everything now is AI, I went to AI and asked for synonyms for this. So compulsion, delusion, enthusiasm, on down through these to then crush, fancy, fetish, hang up, monkey on one's back, must, neurosis, phantom, and thing. So I'll tell you what these are afterwards, and this is a chance to see them big, and I have no idea what it's going to look like on the screen. So be patient for a couple minutes here, and there's a number of these, and take a look at them. So these images are the last 22 of about 930 4-inch square paintings. So in reality, they're 4 inches square. And we're seeing them here as individuals projected large. They are mainly meant to be part of an array displayed composing a pattern, much like a quilt or possibly a woven textile. So hopefully in the spring, we're working on the dates, and then I've got to figure the problem out of putting them up. So you'll get the chance to see them. But in some ways, it's also nice to a bit of work to photograph them and get them set up for this, but to see them large instead of as the array. So that's a coming possibility. And that's about a month ago, a photograph. And those all along there on the right, those are the piles. At that moment, it was probably about 750 of them total. And yes, so Obsession, they're out of an Arches 300-pound watercolor sheet, lay them out and cut them, and you get 35 blanks. And then they tend to go down 4 at a time to be laid out and taped down. And you can kind of see, I took out the border. You see a couple of those laying there face up. So that's one thing that's been going on for a couple of years. So that's a prelude to sort of where we are going to end up looking at some other things, or where that's kind of, well, not the end, but one or a couple things going on right now. So to tie this together, I thought I'd go back, and again, I think it's kind of interesting. The first thread is our previous lectures and the question of composition. So just a couple of statements. Architecture is not a pure art, but rather a productive art, one contaminated with actuality. And a question is architecture a stochastic techne? Just to put something in the background. And the reason, one thing to lay that out before we look at a couple images from the previous lectures. Years ago, I wrote a paper about this on a question of techne, so the question of craft, and you recognize that TECHNE, so our words, technical, technology, technique, all come from the Greek word techne, and I know I don't have the proper emphasis on that E at the end. But in this paper that I gave years ago, I pointed to a book by Nicholas Smith and Thomas Brickhouse. Nick Smith was a faculty here for years. He just retired this last year from out in, I think it's Portland State that he ended up at. But they laid out 7 criteria for this idea. So techne is basically, one way of saying is craft. Some people take it different ways, but that in the Socratic dialogues, they came up with 7 criteria that make something a techne. So rationality and regularity, teachability, learnability. Well, teachability, learnability is the second one. Third, explicability. So being able to explain it, which they kind of go together, but there's specific things about this. Inerrancy, and this one is the problem. That if you have a techne and you're undertaking it, you cannot be in error about it, and we'll get to that one in a minute. Uniqueness, distinctness of subject matter, and then knowledge/wisdom. And in this paper, I used as a foil, and I ended up in a little bit of an email with him, which was kind of nice. Dalibor Vesely, a well-known historian and theorist. So this is an essay from 1985. An article called Architecture and the Conflict of Representation. He cites techne as a concept of instrumentality, which is true, and we think about it that way more or less today. And his quote says, "In disciplines such as architecture, it is believed even today that instrumentality can be reconciled with symbolism. that a balance can be established between them, that instrumentality can produce its own symbolism, or that they can exist independently. The absurdity of such a belief is quite clear when we refer to an earlier tradition which has understood that techne, instrumentality, in quotes from him, and parenthetically, must always be subordinated to poiesis, so where we get poetry, and again, symbolic representation and parenthetically. Because techne refers only to a small segment of reality, where poiesis refers to reality as a whole. And we could dig into that and go a lot of ways with it. But then what I started to say, and this is one of the few places, most of this I'm going to tell you a story, but I'm going to read this. So in my writing, I say Vesely's argument of instrumentality, so his definition of techne, must be subordinated to representation, so poiesis, is one side of the art-science split which plagues architecture and is that which I wish to argue against using our earlier concept of techne. This does not imply that I will argue that instrumentality should be considered primary, however, and actually would like to propose an idea of techne which will not be taken as simple instrumentality or as some simple mechanistic process in the primary way in which we think about, the idea of techne as an instrumentality or as some simple mechanistic process is the primary way in which we think about words like technology, technical, technique in today's discourse. Vesely rightly points out in an endnote reference to Grassi that the art, science, or instrumentality representation split is a very strong concept in our culture, dating back to the 17th century, where the two concepts were split from each other, so we could go digging historically there. Architecture as a discipline is uniquely positioned and it exists at the fulcrum of this art representation or science instrumentality dichotomy, and could both suffer and flourish from the results of the battle over this dichotomy. Contrary to Vesely's position that instrumentality, science, or techne must be subordinated to representation, art, symbolism, poiesis, and the reconciliation between the reconciliation between the two is not possible. I'm arguing that reconciliation is not only possible, it's absolutely necessary for a strong position for the discipline of architecture. By considering our early concept of techne, we may find a guide for that reconciliation and a way to frame useful questions about the nature of the discipline of architecture. So that, to lay that sort of dichotomy out, and Frank touched on it a little bit, a version of this one about fine art and applied art. In his talk last week, we're sort of always kind of circling around this question a little bit. The one that's kind of interesting, if we play out, and just for a couple more minutes here, and this is where stochastic techne comes from. If we play this out, and I'm just going to go ahead and tell you this without reading it, if we play this out a little bit further historically, because it really is a problem that people started to recognize in these ideas. So it's one thing to make an argument in a Socratic dialogue so that the carpenter operates in a way that he knows, how to do carpentry or what he's going to make, or the shoemaker, or other kinds of things where we can speak to it directly to something that has a direct set of outcomes. And that's generally when those Socratic dialogues, the kind of thing that's taken up. But what becomes recognized about the first century AD is the problem that inerrancy is a real problem. So if you take medicine, eventually everybody dies. So if the end is health, then somehow or another it fails. And then one of the others was rhetoric. So the argument, the setup of argument and rhetoric, and that somebody's going to win or lose a debate, and doesn't mean you're not good at rhetoric or have the craft of rhetoric. And architecture was also cited as one of those in two ways and architecture is an interesting one, because when we get architecton, so a combination of things that in some ways that the architect oversees a number of techne is one idea that's there. And the other one is that actually also then, a building can fall down or not work, or you could be not inerrant. And Quintilian is actually the Neoplatonist that suggests this with this set, and declares a new category called stochastic techne. And stochastic is basically, the most basic definition is variable. Has anybody ever done any stochastic math? Nobody wants to be an insurance underwriter to figure out what the odds are you're going to make money. So stochastic math is what's done to set insurance rates is one thing to try to figure that out. But basically, that somehow or another that there's a variable set of things and multiple variables. And in architecture, just to pull that a little bit further out, and we were talking about it in lab a little bit yesterday with my group, that there's so many variables, and as students, you're trying to figure out how to do that, and we tend to bracket things off. We're not screaming about a budget and the third year starting to bring the code into it, or starting to bring physicality into it, and those sorts of questions, which lay a little bit on the instrumentality side. But then in architecture, the sort of big idea side, you can say that, but if you can't physically then execute it, then in some ways it doesn't matter. And then we exist along these spectrums of where everybody in a big firm or something may lie, what they're really good at sometimes. So rather than one person, we've got teams doing things and understanding things. And then in the work, we were discussing yesterday, and I was picking on one poor student in the lab a little bit to help the others, and had made a claim about a window and light, and that's all well and good, or sort of a kind of meta idea about something, but all there was a line and some little hash marks on it. And I said, well, one thing, if you're designing that, well, maybe you need to actually go from the end of taking up what that window really needs to be, even to the point then of physically what it needs to be when developing something. So that's the set of problems, and I know this is kind of sketchy sort of setup of things, but I think it's very understandable that of all the variable ways that we have to think about what we're doing. So with that little introduction, we've seen Campbell Hall, so Patrick presented Campbell Hall to us. And I'm going back and forth through these. I think, Patrick, that this is 2012, so yeah. Patrick with not as gray a hair, and if you found me too. And then Marcus presented his house, and he can yell at me if I stole the wrong images off online. I did find it. But I think actually that image really expresses, in some ways, as an icon, sort of what you intend with the idea. And one of it at night. I don't know whether it was one you showed, but. And then Frank last week with the ARP Foundation. And if we look at these, it's kind of interesting. It's really nice if we talk about from a perspective of maybe I just want to look sort of at composition a little bit and really we can just take it as the facade some ways, but not really. We've ended up with a really nice set of these three, where in a kind of, and I'm making this up a little bit, but in a kind of idea world, WG gives us a thing that actually we can express, so that idea of these two walls, one closed, one open, is an idea. But it's also at its even very early stages, it's a thing of parts that are composed and meant to be that way. And on the other side of that, Marcus has an idea, and I'll use his non-referential architecture, or maybe he can hit me if I'm say the wrong thing here, of a kind of strong form idea that actually wants, if it could be, to be very much purely, it still has to be material, but it wants to be this black object, and trying to limit how much we might see of parts with regard to composition. And kind of nicely, Frank's ends up in the middle of this. It's again a kind of thing that wants to be a monolithic, for the most part, kind of piece, but also is much more quick to, with the concrete, to have to, express what's going on with it. And so if we look back at WG at Campbell Hall, you can ask yourself, and what I want to do is just sort of ask some questions here to open this up, that if you were designing this, and again, somebody says this idea that's sort of solid wall, and then this open wall that lets light in, what's the course of action that somehow or another allows you to make to go sort of where I want to go at, this composition of this facade? So there's a whole host of where light comes in, or where you want diffuse light to come in, or where you can see out. There's all these kinds of questions, but what is it that somehow or another, and then we complicate it, of how it fits within, if we go and remember looking at the section, of really where the floor line is, where the structure is holding things up behind it, to allow this glass facade to be worked out the way it is. So how do you think about that? And many of you will make buildings, and will always, one thing I'll notice a lot of times in student work, that we'll always get the horizontal of the floor somehow or another coming through buildings, and that's really rare, actually, if you go look at buildings, of what's going on. But here, it's rather sophisticated, and it's even more so because it does have an object quality to it, too. And then if we went more looking at it, Patrick and I were talking about this yesterday, then it's very hard, but the ingeniousness of how this thing is set in to connect to Campbell, sit in that ground and allow that there's only one stair in there because every floor opens out to one level. Because in the back, the ground goes up. It is really quite a piece of work as far as that puzzle piece. And then with Marcus's, it's a question, Hans Roth used to talk about sort of Baroque architecture, an idea of something being carved out of a solid rather than being made additive. And again, this is as an idea, realizing even a Baroque church, we're stacking stuff up eventually, but just as the idea. And then, but that in some ways, Marcus wants this to be this pure black thing. And then he also realizes and told us that, here he went and pursued that, but he had with a budget, he had to build it out of wood frame. It couldn't even be trying to pour it in concrete. And we'll talk about even that with concrete in a minute, but the attempt to figure out sort of what would go on it to minimize. But even then, that EPDM or anything he did with it, still has joints in it. And then it had to be figured out where you were going to accept that or have to accept it with the thing, and all the different ways. And I'm sure he thought of all kinds of ways to try to think about doing this. But there's that problem of this idea of very pure, and then and it's one of the hardest things to do. And then with this one, it's kind of this, Swiss, or we could go and think about Ando and his concrete or whatever else. But it's really interesting here because they probably could, the question is how much of the decisions about these joint lines are functions of the formwork system that they were using to do this building, and was it in the idea to begin with or not. But then you can't help but believe that somehow or another, that all of it's thought about, but it's really interesting that where that is, and I don't know whether they tried to look closely here, whether they may have tried to eliminate a form line in there and the way they were treating it. But the decision to do that, and then if you look at other decisions over here, you know, you can start to ask the question, why doesn't maybe that wall go on, but that I get that overhang. Of course, I'm getting that overhang here, but that one stops, that one goes above. And then on the side, it's the same thing. If you look at where all the joints are, of how much of that is intentional, how much of it is about the formwork, but is there any, and then we have to ask too, then, is any of it accidental between the conception and building it? And I don't think that's the case, because Frank had the drawings of where they were showing very explicitly where those things were going to be, but those things exist in these pieces. So I'll leave it at that, but just a kind of set of ideas, just a few ideas about what happens when we're thinking about these things. So the second little thread is a guy named Alan Jacobs. He's a distinguished professor of humanities in the honors program at Baylor, and he's a senior fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. He writes for a journal called the Hedgehog Review, which is the journal of the Institute of Advanced Studies that comes out quarterly. I commend it to you if you've never seen it. And other publication, and he writes the blog, The Homebound Symphony, Stagger On Rejoicing. And you can ask me sometimes, there's meaning behind that name and an interesting book behind it. But he's also written a set of books, and he's written books on C.S. Lewis, just finished a book on a detailed analysis and indexing of Paradise Lost. He's done some of W.H. Auden stuff, but he also has written this series that turned into 3 books that are more or less about the way we're thinking right now. And The Pleasures of Reading in the Age of Distraction is the oldest one. And then the other 2 came pretty quickly behind each other, How to Think, and that one's very interesting. And they're very readable and very, they're not big books. And then the last one is Breaking Bread with the Dead. And then there's one more called In the Year of Our Lord, 1943, which is really interesting because he takes five of the sort of writers or thinkers at the time in England, right at the moment the war was turning, and asking the question about what happens afterwards, what happens with the culture, what do we do coming out of the Depression and the war to think about things. But the one I want to talk about a few minutes is Breaking Bread with the Dead. And it has sort of 5 major points. One thing, the book's title is inspired by W.H. Auden, a poet, who wrote that, quote, art is our chief means of breaking bread with the dead. So I want to leave that one out there. But so I'm going to leave the first one for a second. So as an antidote to presentism, so what he means is, he contends that modern society is plagued by presentism, the tendency to view our current moment as the moral and intellectual peak, dismissing the past as inferior. The book's central argument is that engaging with historical texts and figures, or, quote, breaking bread with the dead, offers a crucial wider perspective to combat this narrow worldview. I'm going to come back to these to talk about this as architects. And then the embracing unlikeness, the book emphasizes the greatest value often comes from not finding figures in the past who confirm our own beliefs, but from encountering those whose worldviews and values are profoundly different. These differences challenge assumptions and force deeper reflection. And then nuanced judgment of the past, which he holds is what we've had a lot of to have a critical engagement with historical figures, but also not to refuse to engage with historical figures because of cultural differences or the sets of things that were going on, in any given moment in time. And then the developing a more tranquil mind is what I put it down. Some have said that as a form of self-help, but he's kind of doing that tongue-in-cheek, that if you develop this, you could have a more tranquil mind. So some of the anxiety or whatever over whatever our cultural situation is at the moment. But this building of personal density is the one I want to touch on the most. So this is drawn from Thomas Pynchon, the Art of Thomas Pynchon, that he picks this idea up from, and explains that interacting with the perspectives of the past helps to increase one's, quote, personal density. This density is a form of inner substance that provides intellectual grounding. It makes a person more resilient against fleeting trends and, as he says, social media anxieties, just speaking in the present moment. And I like this set of things in a way, and I'm just going to right now just deal with this personal density. So how, as it's important to us, thinking about things. So, what kind of practice thickens, your presence or engagement within the discipline? So many of us talk to you about having architectural friends, or even force you through an assignment that you're to study something. How often are you in a discussion with your colleagues about architectural ideas, or hopefully other bigger ideas too, but that sort of thicken the way that you're thinking about things? And then beyond the sort of, why we may look at art, so beyond sort of what, is the kind of technicalities of the profession or doing a design or something else, what builds the fabric of the way you practice? And one last thing about that is, I say this to fifth-year students a lot, what is it you're going to take away as it's a rite of passage to the profession that you've done this degree and you're going out and you're going to go to a firm, and they're going to own sort of your knowledge and the way you work with regard to that firm. And the question is that in that moment of sort of going to that, what are you going to take away that actually you still have control over or own? And it can be any number of things. I'm going to show you sort of what the rest of this, I'm going to show you what my set of that is, but it's not about sort of making the same set or whatever that I'm doing. I'm trying to encourage you that there is a world that somehow or another is out there that actually can feed what you're doing, particularly in the case of directly in practice of what may be the strain or sort of the drive that happens, within a firm or doing professional work. So with that said, we're going to go on the thread, and this next one is the year that Gartner showed up in Blacksburg for the first time. I get a look out of Scott for that. So that year being the fall of 1984. And it was my fourth year. And we were given an assignment to do apartments related. So they were trying to make us think about broader than just, I'm going to make a house. So I'm just going to tell you Scott's, the three he gave, there were three different sets of choices, but the three he gave were T.S. Eliot and Mark Rothko. And I'm going through this, I haven't sort of named all these, so hopefully you're taking notes if there's something you're interested in. And Joseph Cornell. And I'll tell you right now that actually in doing this, I didn't ever find a good way to sort of, he asked me the question, how would these three as clients, how would they see this, we were allowed to pick a site, how would they see the site that you're trying to do this set of houses, apartments on? Which opened up a world for me in a way of thinking about things. And it's interesting that, Mark Rothko, Scott's given a very good lecture, and it's very true sort of how his work developed out of being bodies and gradually becoming to this, and that's another whole talk. But I also always saw it, and again, so this is a matter of interpretation for you, because I saw it in the landscape with the strong horizon, with where I was at. But I'd also always seen those paintings that way, because when I've seen them, the National Gallery or whatever, and I hadn't really read about Rothko or seen his early work, I always saw this intensity in this horizon or these places, and that I always wanted to be able to grab that thing and pull it apart and see what was behind it, was my thinking in it. So I started trying to do watercolor. Never done it before, and I'm not showing you the first ones, which he called throwing water. This is the best one of the first 8 or 10 that I actually do have now framed. It's in my house. And it was a little closer look towards the woods of this place that I was thinking about. And it was on, you can see down there in the bottom right corner, not such great paper. And then a couple of breakthroughs came through, and Scott's probably shocked I still have these things, because I just photographed these last night. I'd never shown them anywhere. The one on the left's the first one, sort of the Rothko in the landscape, that actually kind of worked. And Scott yelled at me because it's on that crappy piece of paper, and you see how it's cut and whatnot, which led to a fetish that goes on to this day. Is ones I'm going to show you. Everything I've done since then has been on 300-pound Arches watercolor paper, which has become very expensive. I think it's like $21 a sheet now, and at that time it was like $6.50, something like that. And on the right, and this is more of a generative one, on the right is an idea trying to figure out about T.S. Eliot. So Eliot's writing, and I kind of took up the 4 quartets. I liked that set of poems the most. And the idea was that Eliot would walk across this site, and it's a site in northeastern North Carolina, and goes across a field, and it's from swamp to swamp and across the field, so the land rises a little bit and then there's drainage. And the idea that he would walk across the field and maybe be thinking about his poetry or whatever and looking very closely at the ground. And this is the first attempt at what that might be. And it turned into, I don't think I have enough, it turned into this 18, so I get obsessive, it turned into this 18-foot line on a 2-foot piece of watercolor paper, done on the end room on the 3rd floor where we're meeting now, our groups. And driving people crazy over a weekend because it's stippled. I sat for a whole weekend doing this as it worked out. And it's very coded, and if somebody wants to see it, I can show you. This one was just the idea, but it hadn't yet been sort of the differences that occur in it. And then towards the end, I'm not showing you everything, but towards the end of this, you can see something, so an attempt at sort of bringing these two things together. So on the right, and the other thing, the site was a site where a house had stood that 4 chimneys were still left. And you see that line sort of going through there, and then the section through the sky. And then one other thing that came out of it in upper right is the site. And this is somewhat accurate, but it's also idealized about where that site is. And that site one was probably, color-wise and stuff, one of the more successful things that came out of that. And then there's one other that I'm just showing you because I don't think it's as successful, but it's partially the project that ended up being put in there with this concrete frame. So we were all sort of Conites. So that's the first sort of round of this. I'm skipping, not that there's not stuff, but I'm skipping 5th year, and it's a longer story. If somebody wants to know, I can tell you. And then grad school came along after 4 years or so, and I started out, and I want to say it's interesting because some of these things still resonate. It sort of still keeps coming around, this was intended to be a little idea. I thought I was going to do this school, and it's a kind of little idea playing on UVA. It's a little idea playing on W.G. Clark. If you you see down the center there, sort of where chimneys are in this thing, and it's a plan. And it turns out that I worked on this stuff, and it never went. This is also loosely a plan with sort of classrooms or faculty housing in the red squares and the dorms or student housing running around them. But it also, I mean, it was done as that idea, but it also, in my head, there was this thing to kind of accept, sort of, and probably in the things that I knew, I've often wondered what it might be like to go fully and make a quilt out of this, for example. So, but this is going to come back around. But it was a kind of schematic, idealized plan, as is this one, which was another version of it. And there's some other drawings that are like this. I'm not going to show you, that collected some things and some fantasies. That one is actually on a piece of white construction paper with a really kind of light wash and discovering pulling ink. But when I found this one, it hit me. Well, I'm going to show you something later, that this is sort of in the background. And then finally I ended up doing a house, and it's back on this site that we were looking at. And you can later tell me sort of this is wrong. And you'll see whether you can, and the committee never said anything about it, but it's wrong. And this is the elevation. And then I was sitting back listening to Marcus's lecture 2 weeks ago, and realized that actually I had done his scheme to some degree, because in this house, you get all the way up, and the bed is sitting on a platform up in here underneath. I was just thinking hip roof, not pyramid, but underneath that pyramid. And the windows are set all the way around to see that landscape when you're laying in the bed. So if you sit in the bed at an eye level there, that's what you get, that horizon. And I could tell you about something about Jefferson at Monticello that's like that too. And you had to go outside to go up and down the stair in that little tower in the front. And then, I don't think, this is not as good a drawing, but this is the side. And for some reason, I can't tell you why, there's all kinds of process drawings, and there's formal sort of drafted drawings of this. For some reason, I never made one of these, which would have been good, of the right-hand side, this image, the back elevation, which is actually a really large window that lets light and stuff into the main body of the house. But it hit me when I was listening to the lecture. Well, it took a while, but then it hit me. I'd done a pyramid that you sleep under. There you can see why the site plan was wrong. But and so revisiting this and expanding across time, be careful. So when I came back to teach and thinking about these things, and another influence that's been in the background is Paul Klee, and this one I gave you the title. It's called Once Emerged from the Gray of the Night. It's from 1918. So it's basically a poem laid out. And someone asked me, because this whole set is called Elliott Clay, this is a page from a sketchbook where I was thinking about just kind of copying or thinking about that, but also bringing T.S. Eliot, so picking my sort of own poem to bring to it, and trying some different things. But I've always enjoyed this. It's in a sketchbook, which led me to think about back to that line in Eliot looking for the poem, and the idea that if I magnified that line, I might find the poem. So I made this alphabet, and I forget what it is, X. I think X is missing. But at any rate, this turned into a project. I can show you. There's drafted drawings of making how these letters work, and there's some problems with it, and there's a drafted layout of how it goes together, and there's a specified manifest, a schedule of how many A's and how many B's, and I made it not by going sort of down the line making them, but I started out and I made all the A's, and I made all the B's and made all the C's along the way. This is for a portfolio at some point. This is a cheat because I scanned one of the letters each, and this is not the whole thing. would put this together in Illustrator. So in this case, everyone in this case that's an E or whatever is exactly the same E, but in fact they vary. Density of color and all kinds of things vary because they were made about 8 at a time. So that's 2 inches square what these are. And the one time that I've had this up, I've had laid it out and had students sort of lay it out and play with it as a silicata. It's about 840 pieces. It's 2'6" by 10 feet. And when I was director of the school, I realized I had metal walls that were magnetic. And I bought strips of magnetic pieces with glue, with adhesive on the back, and cut them up and put one on each one of these tiles and then put it up. So it's the only time I've ever had it up, but that's not quite all the way up. But there is sort of, and again, it's kind of obsessive, I realize, but it's that cycle back to make something else out of this idea that goes on. And then now, currently, I'm going to show you some things that have been done in the last month, along with these 4-inch square things, or I don't say that month, it's 2 months, maybe 3 months, really. And here's a couple influences there, and this is not all of them. So Rothko's still around on those 4-inch squares, but it's something different than that. It's more color fields and how they may go together sort of unexpectedly. And it really depends on, when I've got 4 down, what colors are in the palette from doing something else and playing with them. This is Annie Albers. And so to the textiles part of this, and I hadn't really ever looked at Sophie Arp's stuff that much and realized, I'll show you one actually where there's almost a direct connection that was unknown. And this is another van. This is called Green Pastures, which is one of the things I first started obsessing over. I found this later. And this, and sort of what's going on, it's very hard to sort of get the woven quality. A quilt, one thing about sort of get stitched together and works. This has structure that's going in and warp and weft that are going in and out of each other. And I've tried some sketches trying to think of that, but I haven't really gotten this one. And then one other is a more current guy. His name is Justin Ming Young. He's a young Canadian guy. He's about 30 years old, and his grandmother and his mother did quilting. He was never that interested in it, and then during COVID, he started making things, and now he's been in some of the major museums in Canada with some of these things that he's been making, and I find him really interesting. So a lot of breaking bread with the dead, but this is one that's alive. With interesting things. So here are some of these, a few of these that are more recent. These are 10 by 14 actual size. So that is simply what's known as a log cabin pattern. That's a traditional quilting pattern, and playing with it. And I've done a couple of these. And then this is the one that's a little bit after Justin Ming Young, actually pretty direct. It was when I was just trying something. And it turns out that actually, if you go look up Sophie Arp, there's almost, you can find it also, and it's in the patterns of sort of squares and things of Paul Klee too. But I think it's one thing I really, really liked about it. And usually in these quilts, there's something slipped in where there might have been a need for one more piece of fabric and didn't have it or something. So there's a little surprise or so. But this is one, I have a sketch of this, but this is the one that is, first from that one from Annie Albers. So it has a reference to it, but it becomes something different in doing this. And these, I turned it this way. I made it just in reaching and sort of working on things. I had been working on it with the horizontal portrait, basically, or landscape. And I've really been showing it or thinking about it this way. And it goes back, back to that, and I wasn't even thinking about this, but back to that drawing in grad school, using a flare pen or something it's actually different, but it's a water soluble pen to outline these things, and God knows, the other thing is the sort of, and this is the image that's on the poster that I gave a sort of obscure look at it a different way. There's another, now to think about, there's another thing there, is laying it out and then by hand, making these rectangles or whatever with the pen that has the waggle or the imperfection in it. It actually goes back to understanding Otto Wagner's office, where they would make the perspectives and things that they did and use a ruling pen, but freehand, that actually would give life to the way their perspectives are, if you ever want to go look at those. And that's, again, one of these things that's in the background. This one also was one that took me where I could see it as possibly an elevation. It made me think about it back towards composition and architecture, which made me think of something that it was kind of like. And then I made another one, and so is this one. And a lot of times I don't give titles, but this one is called Raphael Winks at Annie. And so you can figure out what my students know, because we looked at this, but what the reference is there. But again, it's sort of a play on of this, and it also sort of wanting to go back to, and when we get back to building materials and assemblies, when we're talking about facades and a world that's opened up more and more of more compositional flat-on facades here recently, we'll come to this, but we'll mainly be talking about how the terracotta is hung, but it matters about this. And then that's the sketch of it in a sketchbook. So I just show you one sketch for an idea and then carrying it out. And then I've made it pretty good on time, so we're right on it. One last thing is Bill Brown, and Bill Brown is a emeritus professor who was head of the graduate program when I was a student, and for years, till the late 90s, I guess, when he took an offer and retired, and is happily in Williamsburg now, as far as I know. And he gave a lecture in this room on the Potsy Chapel. And it's always intrigued me in the times I've gotten to visit there. He made the case that this elevation, which everybody, across time is very enamored with, and all the arguments, Brunelleschi started it and who did it, or the front was not done until well after Brunelleschi's death. And Frank and I went to the Branch Museum to hear a talk by art historians at VCU. They were making a proposal that want just the sort of center portion as a portico there and take off the rest of the side, which is rather important because it's the walkway that gets you between the church and the cloister that's back behind there. But he made the case that that we could look at this and think of it that it was the first modern curtain wall. And it's a push. But it's also rather interesting to think about it that way. And there's also sort of the interesting problems are in there, is like that arch over that center having to come down where the square panels are coming down, that somebody later might have doubled up a column or moved something to get space to let things finish. This building is full of things like that. The inside, you try to draw it as a perfected geometry, and then you have to have the thickness of the pilasters and things, and it gets mucked up. You find out that it doesn't quite work, and that where things have to be added to what was a perfected idea to physically make it then be that. But that's another story too. Here's this vault, and one of the things that came up in this lecture, and I can't find the study, but I like this idea, that somebody finally got up there, that portico, that loggia up on the top, is simply a roof to protect. There's a little dome, you can see the top of it in the center, and there's two barrel vaults running along the side there looking through it. And I like the idea that they brought up this study that went up there and got permission and hadn't been looked at in a long time, that in fact this barrel vault is probably not a barrel vault, it's probably segments that are actually beams, because that front wall really wouldn't be very good at taking the thrust load that a barrel vault would be putting on it. So it's kind of an interesting idea that would take it more towards a modern idea of how to get a shape or something while still wanting to be a barrel vault. But at any rate, that occurred, and this is the last one that I did, and it's a little bit of a push and a play, but hopefully you can somewhat recognize what it is, and then turn into a pattern and abstract it a bit. And then one last thing, because I got a minute. Other thing that's been going on for the last year and a half is I've been sending these postcards, they're 4x6, to my friend and classmate, Mark Blizzard. And before somebody asks, yes, he lives at 214 Spacious Sky. Leave it to Texas, that's the name of the street. But at any rate, this was the first one. And there have been batches of them that came along, and I don't know whether you sort of recognize or of a play between making a story up about Paul Klee and Louis Sullivan, which is total fiction, but it could have happened. And then these are a couple more recent ones. And they vary quite a bit depending upon my mood. I'll sketch out. I usually do they're done 3 at a time, and then I usually do 6 or 9, and then they get mailed, and there's all kinds of coding about I like playing with them. He hasn't yet figured out what ISPU stands for. And they vary too, it's a lot quicker to make one that's more one of these sort of colors, back to Rothko studies, and play with it. And they did get one this is in the 4 series of both YTTE and ISPU. And I'll conclude with, and I'll tell you, and with all the stuff that I'm showing you, sort of working on something or where you might get a little bit crazy to do 900 of something, that ISPU stands for incremental stuff piles up. So thank you. So, happy to take a question or tell me I'm crazy. Who has one? Andrew, okay.
So Hunter, I thought maybe just to flip the Alan Jacobs thing, just if you could comment on this. I like the idea conceptually of breaking bread with the dead, but I thought given the context, I noted the concept of presentism. Mm-hmm. Is there a way to break bread with the living?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's his setup. And I think actually one of the things, I would encourage you to maybe look at his blog. I find him very useful. And there's a group of people that across that center at UVA and stuff that he's talking to, that in some of the rhetoric or whatever we're living with right now, that actually a lot of his positions are actually one of being, sort of very broad about listening and understanding, ideas, and you can take that into art or whatever else, but politics creeps into it sometimes. And I think he would say that. I think he has a problem with the sort of somebody that has no sort of depth in that, making some kind of declaration about something that's never been, or nobody's done this before, or whatever else, I think is where that little rub comes from about presentism.
setting out, like the setting out line. All of these have a kind of underlying.
Yeah, so I mean, that's the architect in some ways. I had a few of them framed just a short while ago, and when I was getting it done, they said, do you want us to come into the color? And there's a pencil line there, and initially, and I said, well, no, I intended that to be there. No, I don't want it covered up. She said, oh, did you make this? And well, yeah. So I thought maybe I had bought them, and I think it's important. Maybe I should have put a slide in. I have some because I take pictures every now and then of them, of things in process. And I showed that sketch, but I didn't really put. I could have put a series of those things in that. So like let's just take the 4-inch square one. So I said, you lay out a sheet and get 35 of those squares if you're careful. And then you got a 4-inch square, and then I lay 4 of those down, and use some drafting dots to tape the edges down, and then I put that little 1/4-inch border, which you didn't see because I cut that off in these big images, but because it's hard to get them perfect. But there's a 4-inch border which will show up when they're in an array that's around it, so that gets drawn. And then blue painter's tape is the thing now of masking all of them, and then they're painted. And then it's when it dries enough, then it's reversed. And then in the bigger ones and those patterns and things, it usually is sitting down and in a way almost kind of drafting, make a sketch and then try to figure it out, and sometimes just as a guide, that some of those rectangles and stuff, there's a grid, but the one to the other, if you look close, you'll find the line because I've just got a guideline of what the division is in there. But so they're almost all of these things are something that would be, I would say, a tendency that it is, it's constructed in a certain way that is kind of consistent to a crazed architect.
Does the composition come about in that setting out, or in the painting, or in the dialogue between the two?
Usually it's across all things. Maybe I should have put, because it's like with those ones with Annie Albers, I showed the one which is the Raphael one, but the others they're sketches of, and the sketches are very different. I mean, the first one for Annie was looking at that, looking at an image and then thinking about something and laying something out, and I was using pens and I was kind of hatching or doing different things, and when I was with the graduate students this summer sitting when nobody was, talking, worked on that, and it gradually became something different. So there's another one that I didn't show you an image of that's the same idea but very different between the sketch and then what ended up being laid out. And that one also changed. It's more of a pattern one that changed by making decisions when painting it. Anything else, Andrew?
Do you mind elaborating on what affects your productivity before, during, and after doing these drawings? So in other words, in the immediate workspace, when you're listening to music,
Yes.
you want total quiet. Are you more productive on days when it's raining? See what I mean?
I like days it's raining. I haven't thought about that, but yeah. Generally, when I'm doing these, I like, we'll have music on. Not crazy, but some music. But yeah, I mean, sometimes it's, with the 4-inch squares, I've, sort of know how much time it takes to do one set of 4. And maybe sometimes it's quick. Last night I finished sort of the lecture and ended up doing 2 sets of them before I decided to go to bed. So there's 8 more in existence this morning. And then there's times that I really kind of get surprised on a day. Well, I mean, it's been in the summer, it's a little different now, but sit down and start doing them, and you know, might do 20 or 24 or something in a day. Actually, on the back of them, they're dated and it goes through the alphabet, you know, until the next day. And the bigger ones, a lot of times it takes sort of starting out and laying it out and then coming back to it. But I find usually once I start into it, even if it's going to take a couple hours or 3 hours, unless I'm pressed by something out, you know, I'm going to want to sit there and keep going with it.
Following up this question, you seem to have an unbelievable production.
Mm-hmm.
You know, writers talk about a writer's block. Do you ever have a painter's block?
Yes. I mean, it'll, you know, something else will be going on. You know, where, I don't know where Jim is, but, or Bill. I mean, when I was director of the school, you know, nothing like that went on. And one of the things right after that is that this 4-inch square started, you know, with the leave in the spring of 21. So after COVID, and after stepping down, they date back to that point, and they go, and it does go in cycle and spurt, and then the Elliott Clay sort of line, you know, that went over. The idea probably hit like in 93 or 94, and it probably wasn't until 99 or so that the whole thing was done. And it would be, you know, a moment where several days and, you know, 40 or 50 of them would get done, and then it would go a couple of months, and then, you know, and again, it piles up. I mean, sometimes I don't think I'm that productive at all. And I haven't shown, you know, the other thing is so all this stuff, I haven't done this somehow or another that I was going to go out and, you know, in today's world, it's, you know, it's not on Instagram trying to, you know, do something. I'm really doing it for me. I mean, I'm hoping that we're going to make an exhibit or maybe something will come of it. The idea has come up because there's a lot of the faculty that I could sort of name that have beautiful things going on, that maybe within the college that the Moss might want to have an exhibit of faculty, you know, pick a piece or two from 10 or 12 faculty and make an exhibit, because I think it would be interesting.
When is the set complete?
Of the 4x4s? That's a good question. I was thinking about that. I crossed that 900. I hadn't been figuring it out, but I sat down and counted them up. And I'm beginning to wonder, because I have more than enough. If I wanted to cover one of the 12-foot panels in Kogel, it could go from bottom of the panel to the top of the panel, which I don't think I want to do. And they're in sets. They're in sets, so I counted them. When you see them stacked up, they're in sets of 36. It takes 36 to make a 4-inch line 12 feet long, which is, I just sort of started with that as stacking them. And right now, I crossed that threshold, and then I had just made, usually when I make some, I take 3 sheets of arches and sit down and lay them out and cut them all in a session, which I find is a good time to think about things too when doing that. But that makes, if I don't make any mistakes, sometimes you make a mistake in cutting or something, but if I don't make any mistakes, that's 105. And there's a stack right now that's probably in the 90s. That's where the last set that I cut out. So they're sitting there blank right now. So there's probably at least that many more. It depends, actually. These other things have been happening. I think actually I may put more time into the bigger ones. There's another whole project that's called Verona Springs that I've got 1 or 2 for that I didn't show you anything of. And there's a really big one, which is some way of combining all this stuff and maybe making a 4-foot square. Like the particular one is the elevation of the Sullivan Bank in Sydney, Ohio, to see them make a construction and painting somehow. But I've got pieces, but I haven't really figured that one out. So that's a big, that one you gotta be. I saw on one, and I didn't put it in here, where I wrote a nasty note to myself about something bigger, trying to do something, and it says, go ahead and do it, don't be blank. So anything else? I hope you enjoyed seeing them, and again, I want to kind of push to open up the idea that whatever it is, that you find other things that sort of thicken how you're working. So thank you.